So I'd like to introduce Dr. Jonathan Richardson. He is with the Providence College. Hi, how you doing?
How are you? Nice to meet you.
Good, so good to see you. Scoot over a little bit more so we can see you. All right, so you actually just released a study on the science of road pollution, road and the ecology of that, and how it's damaging evolution. It's somewhat of a summary, a non-technical summary of that.
I thought it was great.
So, okay, I was in college a while ago. So let's talk a little bit about this study that you did, the paper that you released, and really why that's important, and really why people should even care about it. So let's start off about kind of why you did this. From what I've read, it seems like there wasn't really a lot of work about this, about road ecology and pollution.
Yeah, well, it's interesting because there actually was a lot of work done on road ecology, the ecological effects of roads. And let me just back up and say that the main premise of the study and our research is to really focus on, we know that humans have a big and rapid effect on the environment. They're creating new environments very quickly, and it creates a very significant challenge for the organisms that live in those habitats and need to adapt and change fast enough to survive into the future. So that's the broad perspective. It's the effects of humans broadly. Roads are a really important component of human activity. So we know just all of us probably drive around on roads, and roads carve up the landscape. Turns out there's actually 40 million miles of roads globally, and that's doubled in the last 10 years and is expected to increase at a similar rate. So roads are here to stay. They're an important part of our human infrastructure, but they do have important effects on wildlife and plants. I don't want to discriminate against plants. I usually focus on animals, but plants are just as important.
Too.
My botanist friends would be appalled if I forgot those guys. But roads are a significant change in the environment. And one thing we wanted to understand is, okay, how does evolution affect that? There's been about 20 or 30 years of research focused on ecological effects. So that's roadkill mortality, that's toxicity for the organisms from roads you were alluding to. And also things like carving up the landscape. It's harder for an animal to move from one side of Interstate 95 to the other side of Interstate 95.
Yeah.
And so that research has been going on for 20 or 30 years. Keep in mind, roads have only been around for insignificant quantities and sizes.
200 years?
Not even, probably 80 to 90 years, shortly after
Real
World War I.
pavement roads, yeah.
Right. And so these are new influences on the landscape. They're new influences for wildlife species and plant species. And so we've just been getting a handle on the ecological effects. But to your point, we knew almost nothing about the evolutionary effects. So species can respond to changes in the environment. That's something that we don't usually appreciate. But they certainly can evolve through natural selection. So that's where you have certain traits that are beneficial in certain environments. And when environments change, the traits that make those organisms better in those environments will start to mean those animals succeed, they reproduce more, they produce more offspring, and those genes, those advantageous traits are passed on to future generations, and they become a larger part of the population. So that's good. That helps them cope with environmental changes. And environments have been changing forever. But the thing that's new about human impacts is how fast they change. And roads is a perfect example. You know, the last 80 or 90 years, something that was non-existent is now really, really important. So the evolutionary effects of roads, we talked about the ecological effects. So the same things that lead to road mortality. So, you know, a deer trying to cross the road during the rutting season getting hit, obviously that's really bad for that deer and it's not good for the population. But we do know from some species now, in the very limited studies that have been done, a species of bird has actually evolved shorter wings in response to living around roads. This is a cliff swallow. And the ones that get hit by cars now, fewer of them get hit by cars, but the ones that do have longer wings, and the ones in the rest of the population that are surviving have shorter wings.
And you've seen them change and adapt to that within that short amount of time?
Within 20 or 30 years in that scenario. Wow. That's not our research, but that's something we pulled together for the project you were talking about. And so the idea is that the shorter your wings are, the more agile you are, and the easier it is to avoid, or the more likely you are to avoid a car coming at 60 miles an hour. Yeah. So in addition to things like wing length and avoiding actually being hit by a car, you can evolve resistance to toxic compounds in the environment. So we spread a lot of road salt here in the Northeast, and as part of that, that's pretty toxic for the animals, especially aquatic animals and things living right on the side of the road. But we know that the longer a population, say a plant or an animal, has been around that environment, the more likely they are to have evolved to do better in those environments and be able to deal with those toxins in a way that they wouldn't have been able to do when we first started putting salts down on the roads, things like that.
So, is this concerning? Is this disconcerting? Is this just you put it out there because someone needed to do it?
Yeah, well, there's good hopeful news in this research, and there's also not so hopeful news. So I think about environments changing and how fast they're changing to a treadmill. So imagine you're on a treadmill, it's not moving. That would be an analogy to the environment not changing. You're a species, everything's fine, it's not changing, so you can stay the way you are, you're perfectly adapted. But what if we turn that treadmill on? What if we start moving it slowly? Most species will be able to adapt slowly over long periods of time and be able to persist. But what humans are doing in terms of the things that we're introducing in the environment and how we're changing the environment is that we're turning that treadmill on really, really fast.
Yeah.
And so the species that we see persisting in these environments are ones that are able to run a little faster. And the analogy is they can evolve much more faster than other species, or at least than we appreciated before. And so what we focused on here is roads because it's such an important part of the landscape. But the hopeful news is that a lot of species, when we do look, are able to evolve. It doesn't mean they're all going to evolve fast enough to persist, but it is good news, that they can mitigate those changes in the environment by changing themselves and evolving to persist. The bad news is some of them can't, and we do lose those through extinction.
Were you surprised when you saw the results? Were you surprised when you saw these animals being able to adapt? What seems like 20 years, relatively, that's a short amount of time.
Yeah, so 20 years ago, if you had told ecologists or evolutionary biologists that this happened, they would look at you like you were crazy. There's no way. It was just part of the paradigm that evolution took thousands or millions of years even to change species into differently adapted species. But I would say in the last 10 or 15 years, really, we've started to find more and more examples of rapid evolution, things that can happen fast enough to matter for dealing with changing environments. So the results of our study maybe weren't surprising in terms of being the first to find rapid evolution, but certainly in the context of roads it is. And lots of people, even people that have nothing to do with science, nothing to do with evolutionary biology, they can relate to a road. They drive on a road. Unfortunately, most people, even myself, have hit wildlife on roads inadvertently. And so you can immediately connect that effect of human activity on wildlife and wildlife populations. I think everybody can connect to that. So I think that was part of the study and why it's gotten some attention as well.
And you said some examples. You said the cliff swallows. You had the red fescue grass, spotted salamanders, and wood frogs. Those are some of the examples that you had in this study. We already talked about the swallows, but how are some of these others affected by the roads and road pollution and just the impact of people on the roads?
Sure. So for my botanist friends, I'll definitely talk about the red fescue grass. So it's not the only species of grass, but grasses are what typically grow in the medians and on the side of the road. It's kind of the only things that can resist for long periods of time when you have a lot of, in this case, salt deposition. But what happened in the case of a lot of those plants, including the red fescue grass, is that roads, there's a gradient. So the closer these grasses are to the road, the more resistant they are to toxic exposure. So this is where we bring these guys into the lab and we actually expose them to different toxicants they would see through road salt or through brake dust, heavy metals and lead, while we had leaded gas. And the closer they are to the road, the more well adapted they are to dealing with those contaminated environments. And as you move away from the road, there's a nice clean gradient where they become less adapted because they haven't been exposed to it as much, or at least the concentrations haven't been as high.
So then when people are building new infrastructure, building new roads, we're not really doing it as much here, but in other places when they're building and expanding, would people look at this and say, oh, that type of grass can tolerate this kind, so would they take that and then plant it? Can you look at this kind of study that you're doing and be able to use this and then take these type of animals or to take this type of plant and use it in their infrastructure?
Yeah, no, that's a good point. It's a question for a civil engineer. I can answer it a little bit, but yeah, certainly civil engineers that are forward thinking in terms of how they integrate infrastructure, human infrastructure, with the biotic community or nature. Do think about the species of plants to plant in an area that will be most likely to persist. Obviously, they don't want to plant a bunch of stuff and invest a lot of money and have it all die after the first winter. So they do think about that more so in some places than others, because money is limited. But in terms of what I focus on, conservation biology, it's really important in the sense that if we can identify, say, areas of well-adapted plants or well-adapted animals that have been able to evolve to deal with roads, if we think about other areas where they're doing very poorly, maybe this is a source for individuals we call it translocate, so to move to another location to supplement an unhealthy population. So if we're trying to figure out between hundreds of other populations which ones we want to take individuals to and help this population that's not doing well, we would try to find one that shows some evidence of being adapted to these stressful conditions.
Okay. So you would explain that in layman's terms, like what can I do? So that's what you do.
Yeah.
But what can I do, or what can someone at home do? Because we're talking about, let's move on to the conservation part now, because that's what's important. So when people driving down the road are thinking about this now, like, oh, I'm making an impact on animals and plants just by driving, which you would think people know anyway, but they don't. So what can someone do to help?
Yeah, so that's sort of a global question, right? I mean, unless you are a lobbyist with the Rhode Island Department of Transportation, there's probably not a lot you can do to impact their decisions in terms of how they manage winter weather in that case. But in your own on your own property, your own driveway, it's fairly easy to move away from salt-based de-icers in that case, or maybe you can pre-treat it. We know that something we call anti-icers, things that we apply before a snowstorm, it actually prevents the snow from bonding to the asphalt and the ice from even developing on the asphalt. So you can apply those, which require a lot less of the actual toxic compounds and the salts that will eventually make it from your driveway into the local watershed. There was a study in Minnesota where they found 70% of the salt that's put down, both on the roads and just in neighborhoods as well, individual driveways, ends up in the local watersheds. So it actually 70% of the salt ends up in the water. And that's not where it's targeted to go, right? That's a side effect. So in terms of...
That's frightening.
It is, yeah. So in terms of our own individuals, certainly what we do around our own houses can make a difference. Not as large of a difference, arguably, as what your town does, which you could lobby your town to make more environmentally conscious decisions about winter weather management, and then the Rhode Island Department of Transportation. And I will say that they do a pretty good job. They've reduced salt application by about 25% in the last 10 years. So I think they're doing something to mitigate the negative impacts of salt. I think they're aware of it, and I think they're conscious of it. I think Rhode Island does pretty well.
That's good. That's good to know. They're doing something well.
Yeah, Massachusetts actually is the state that applies the most salt, as I understand it, by road mile. So we measure these things in road mile.
Okay.
Yeah, or lane mile.
And they usually have more trucks out there. They have state trucks out there that are, when there are big storms, they have an influx of trucks out there. So maybe that's why.
Yeah, maybe.
Per mile. So what are some of so we talked about a few of the animals and types of, for your botanist friends that were out there, species of plants and grasses that are doing well. What are some that aren't?
Well, that's probably a bigger list, honestly.
Yeah.
Now, moving away from just salts themselves, obviously we know that human activity is changing landscapes from, in this area it was mostly forest, and now it's moved towards more development. It's a little funny in New England because we had a huge forest loss when we had colonial settlement and development early on, and then when we abandoned agriculture we had more forests coming into the landscape. Now it's sort of eroding back because we have more developments for housing and things like that. But anyway, so it's a little complicated here in the Northeast, but we know that changing the landscape from a lot of forest to a lot of other things like suburban lawns and industrial developments takes away habitat. And that's the real factor that seems to be affecting most species negatively, is removing their habitat and replacing it with something else. So some things do really well when you do that, like weedy species. In the cities, things proliferate when you have urban settings like rats and pigeons. I do a lot of work with urban rats as well in New York City.
Maybe you can come back and talk to us about that.
Yeah, I'd be happy to. They are demonized for good reasons. They do harbor a lot of parasites. We do some work on that. But they also are very, very adaptable, and that's why they succeed with humans. So the news isn't always bad. If you like rats, if you like pigeons, if you like urban wildlife, some of them do quite well around humans because we supplement their food. Other things obviously don't. If we think about beavers and muskrats and those things that are aquatic, they tend to really be reduced in number and whether they're there or not based on human activities. Even in rural areas, if you have a lot of agriculture or logging practices, you'll have the beavers sort of recede from those habitats. So some species do quite well in urban habitats. I don't want to make it sound like human activity is not like it hurts everything, but yeah, there are a lot of species that do well and a lot of species that are hurt.
So do you think overall the takeaway from this for just the regular person out there is just to be a little more conscious and a little more aware, or do you think it's just continue on with your daily life?
No, I think awareness is a big part of this. I mean, if you think about even trash management. So if you hopefully people aren't doing this as much as they used to, but throwing your trash out there, it's going to end up in that mix of road salts and things that the plows move along and really pollute the environment. So I think that individual decisions are important in this. Specifically related to that study that we did and the sort of illumination of the role of evolution here. I don't know if there's a whole lot people can do about that other than these big picture things like reducing salt in the municipal infrastructure and how we treat winter storms. But certainly it is important to be aware of this because with things like climate change, a lot of things will be changing in a lot of ways, and not only just how they evolve, but where they move. So one big response we see to climate change is as temperatures get warmer and warmer, farther and farther north, you see species moving north to try to keep up with their optimal temperature range. And so that has big implications for humans because we know that the ticks that transmit Lyme are also marching northward with the white-footed mice. There's a study that just came out last year in Ontario, Canada, where incidence of Lyme disease is going up, as well as the white-footed mouse, which is one of the main hosts for the tick, and the tick feeds on the mouse gives it the Lyme bacterium, and then they feed on us, and they give it to us. So being aware of these changes and adaptations that species have and these movements with changing environments, I don't know if there's a lot people could do on a day-to-day basis, or at least I don't have any suggestions for those big picture things today here for you. Wish I did. But being aware of it is certainly important in terms of figuring out how invested you want to be in terms of lobbying for a different route in terms of human activity and how we want to go about making our living in the world.
And making it more comfortable for us and our surroundings.
And keeping it sustainable for us and our surroundings, yeah.
Great. Dr. Jonathan Richardson is here from Providence College. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you.
It's actually very fascinating. And I was trying to read the study and got my hands on most of it and a couple different links. So thank you so much for sharing that with us. From Providence College, thank you so much for joining me. I really appreciate your time and look forward to hearing more from you. So especially maybe on some rats.
Urban rats. Everybody loves them. Well, everybody hates them, but they like to learn about them.
I would like to learn more. Okay, we'll keep in touch.
Thank you.
Thank you so much for joining us on Go Local Live. Appreciate your time.